Welcome to the Irish Revolution. More than any other country, I think, can Ireland claim to have a special relationship with the United States. Every St. Patrick's Day, our Taoiseach Prime Minister presents a bowl of shamrocks to the United States President. For one day a year, a small country on the periphery of Europe is celebrated around the world and has the attention of the political class of the world's superpower. In April of 2019, Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives, came to Dublin and spoke in front of the Dáil and said that Britain would never have a free trade agreement with America post-Brexit if it did not honour the Good Friday Agreement with Northern Ireland in full. We punch above our weight as a country. It's a kind of soft power that the Republican leadership recognised back in 1919. Eamon de Valera, President of the Republic, along with a contingent that included Liam Mellows and Harry Boland, went to America in the summer of 1919 in an attempt to achieve three things. 1. Achieve diplomatic recognition of the Irish Republic by utilising the power of Irish America in lobbying the institutions of the American Republic. Number 2. Spread propaganda about the Irish Revolution and raise consciousness in this vital country. And number 3, raise money for the cause. Eamon de Valera arrived in New York on June 11, 1919, after being smuggled onto a boat in Liverpool, England. De Valera had escaped Lincoln Prison in England in February and had spent the last few months on the run in Ireland, although to be honest the authorities weren't that interested in actually nabbing him, not wanting to give him any more publicity than he had already earned. So why did de Valera want to go to America? He hoped to gain American recognition of the Irish Republic and to raise money and publicity for the cause. New York was full of powerful Irish Americans with deep emotional connections to the motherland, and he hoped to exploit this to the maximum. There was already a deeply influential Irish American movement called Clan the Gael, under the leadership of John Devoy, who also ran a newspaper called the Gaelic American. The Friends of Irish Freedom, the FOIF, was set up on March 4, 1916, and by 1919 had 100,000 members as well as 175,000 associate members affiliated to other Irish American organisations such as the ancient Order of Hibernians. This was the main liaison with the Sinn Féin party and the revolutionary Dáil government up until the split in November 1920. As we'll see, de Valera rustled some feathers over there and disturbed the rather complicated world of Irish American politics. According to the 1900 census, some 5 million Americans were either Irish born or had Irish parents. This was more Irish than lived in Ireland. Many of these Irish were indeed more patriotic than the Irish in Ireland. Okay, perhaps that's an exaggeration, but it is a truism that immigrants tend to hold more closely their identity than those who stay at home, and often are much more nationalistic as a result. This can be seen time and time again, and not just in the Irish case. You see this in plenty of international cases. In any case, it was clever of the revolutionaries in Ireland to recognise that America held a lot of promise for the cause and that they were determined to exploit their connections to the maximum. Recognition. There was a widespread belief in Ireland that de Valera's trips throughout the United States, which was rather impressive in its own right, was a gigantic public relations victory for the Irish cause. The limits of this campaign were revealed, however, in the summer of 1920 when the Democratic and Republican parties both held their conventions and neither party voted to support recognition of the Irish Republic. The closest the Irish Republic would come to recognition was during the debate over the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles, the post-war peace treaty. 14 reservations have been introduced to the treaty in the Senate by the Republican leadership, and that's US Republican, not Irish Republican. A 15th reservation was added at the last minute by Peter Gerry of Rhode Island, who introduced the following, quote, "In consenting to the ratification of the treaty with Germany, the United States adheres to the principle of self-determination and the resolution of sympathy with the expectations of the Irish people for a government of their own choice adopted by the Senate on June 6, 1919, and declares that when such a government is attained by Ireland, a consummation it is hoped is at hand, it should be promptly admitted as a member of the League of Nations," unquote. The Gerry reservation passed by 45 votes to 38. De Valera was obviously delighted and called for a Te Deum across Ireland in celebration. Just a few days later, it emerged that the Senate would not pass the Treaty of Versailles, including the Irish reservation. That was that then. Despite much trying, de Valera never even got close to the President, recognising the Irish Republic. The relationship between the United States and the British Empire, just after emerging together victorious in a world war, was not to be interfered with by the Irish question. Money. By the end of 1920, the Dáil government in Ireland was in need of cash and were waiting for the American money to arrive. $5 million, which is what they raised, was worth a lot back in those days. In fact, as it happened, very little of that cash made its way back. Turns out it was rather difficult to transfer this kind of money internationally in 1920, especially when its recipient was a revolutionary government unrecognised by any other country in the world. The money raised in America was impressive, but as an actual meaningful source of funds for the emerging counter-state in Ireland, it was next to non-existent. By one estimate, I refer to Arthur Mitchell here, the Dáil had 130 modestly paid employees and was supported by a much larger number of unpaid volunteers. It was an extremely lean operation. There were issues with the money itself. A prominent critic was a New York politician, W.F. Quinn, who denounced the bond drive. Quote, "A bond drive is a financial yen against a tangible property. The misty dream of a deluded agitator is not and never can be called security for a bond issue." Unquote. There were opponents in America too. Irish Americans, while by now had begun to penetrate the political and commercial heights of the country, were still very much a community in development and did indeed still face discrimination. Mississippi Senator John Sharp Williams wondered if De Valera should be indicted for agitating against an American ally. The Wall Street Journal wrote on the 4th of February 1920 that, quote, "Legally everything hangs on the terms on which the money was taken by the seller of these mere receipts. Sold as bonds, the De Valera issue is nothing more or less than a swindle," unquote. By and large though, Irish America was behind the bond drive, even if these practical complaints would result in the money not really going to where it was intended. The participation was really impressive. The bond drive raised around $5.1 million with 303,578 individuals contributing to it. The majority of these people donated in relatively small amounts. For example, $1 million was raised in New York from 100,000 people. These working class Irish or Irish Americans gave what little money they had to a cause which many had never expected would become a reality. They wrote personally to De Valera with their cheques, and their contribution to the cause must have felt deeply personal. This, ultimately, was the main effect of the bond drive. It galvanised Irish America and was a major international propaganda victory for the Irish Republic, a kind of utilised soft power, taking advantage of the huge Irish American population and anti-British sentiment among them. But as financial power for the Republic, the money was not very useful. Propaganda. De Valera and his entourage went to a huge number of cities and spoke in front of large crowds. This alone was a propaganda triumph. The scale of the trips was immense. Here's a quote from Harry Boland describing an itinerary. Quote, "I am about to go on tour from New York through Penna, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, to Denver, Colorado, Salt Lake, Butte, Seattle, Tacoma, Frisco and Los Angeles, then through the south to Florida." Unquote. So they went everywhere basically. On the 18th of October 1919, they visited the Chippewa Indian Reserve in Wisconsin at the invitation of the chief. Sorry for the pronunciation there. As David Fitzpatrick wrote, quote, "This adventure symbolised the broader fraternity of the Irish with other oppressed peoples." Unquote. There was a service where De Valera smoked a peace pipe and was presented with a wampum belt, which was regarded as a very precious gift. Remarkable pictures were taken of De Valera in Indian garb, an early case of cultural appropriation. It was not all smiles and handshakes, however. America had been gripped by war fever and jingoism in 1918, and many Americans would have regarded Irish opposition to conscription, for example, or the Republicans conspiring with the Germans in the run-up to the 1916 Rising with great suspicion. The Irish delegation attempted to move beyond this, in part by emphasising their admiration for President Wilson's noble war aims, while denouncing his exclusion of Ireland from his principle of national self-determination. The American Legion used its influence among veterans to disrupt Irish meetings and receptions for De Valera. Also, let us not forget that until the election of John F. Kennedy a few decades hence, America never had a Catholic president, and Catholicism was regarded with great suspicion among American evangelicals and mainstream Protestants. There was a, quote, "orange lobby," unquote, in American politics, and De Valera was deprived of a formal reception in a few cities such as Pittsburgh as a result of this. The Irish delegation did all they could to deny any sectarian element to the Irish Republican struggle. This was complicated by the arrival of an Ulster delegation in November 1919, whose aim was to proclaim Ulster's right to self-determination. Ulster being the northern majority Protestant province of Ireland and the part of Ireland most loyal to the United Kingdom. The delegation consisted of 6 clergymen and a member of Parliament, and they spent 12 weeks touring the country. The Ulster delegation, though modest in comparison to the Republican one, earned a lot of attention for their cause. They also won expressions of solidarity from politicians such as Vice President Thomas Marshall, Democrat, and Governor Calvin Coolidge of Massachusetts, a future Republican president. Okay, now the split. I'll be honest with you, reading and talking about the split was a dreadfully tedious business. It's that old joke, what's the first item on the agenda? The split. Big characters with big egos getting all offended all so easily. It'll remind you of a Twitter spat or something, or even worse, student politics. At around the same time, as it became clear that neither the Democratic nor the Republican Party would formally recognise the Irish Republic, De Valera came into conflict with the Friends of Irish Freedom and Clan na Gael, the existing Irish American structures. Clan na Gael was the American equivalent of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, which De Valera interestingly was not a member of, although Clan na Gael was hardly a secret society actually. I emphasise this as the role of secret societies in the Irish Revolution tends to be exaggerated, and there were some notable leaders at the time who didn't participate in them on principle grounds. John Devoy wrote a letter to John A. McGarry, a Chicago-based Clan na Gael member, on 26 of February 1920, which outlines pretty well the conflict. Quote, "His head is turned to a greater extent than any man I've met in more than half a century. We cannot permit the continuance of the present intolerable relations without assuming responsibility for very serious danger to the cause." Unquote. Devoy and Justice Daniel F. Colohan planned to expose De Valera at a meeting at the Park Avenue Hotel on the 19th of March 1920. They had invited 75 of the most prominent Irish Americans, judges, lawyers, politicians, clergy. The plan was to have a kind of trial in absentia. However, Joseph McGarry, a De Valera loyalist, got wind of the plan and told De Valera what was up. He was supposed to be in Chicago, but he changed his plans and McGarry went to the meeting as his eyes and ears instead. Colohan said that De Valera was a vain and ignorant man, that he lived in royal luxury in fancy hotels. This part was rather true. Wasted money in America and spread discord in Irish America, claiming there was nothing but solidarity before he arrived. Devoy then followed up and claimed a major mishandling of the bond drive and criticised De Valera for suggesting a kind of compromise, an early iteration of De Valera's theory of external association, which I'll outline in greater detail in the future. McGarry then spoke up and asked simply where De Valera was and why he wasn't asked to defend himself. Someone in the room replied that he was in Chicago, and then with a wonderfully dramatic flourish, McGarry announced that he was in fact only a few blocks away at the Waldorf Hotel. The participants then decided it was only right to invite De Valera after much debate. Harry Boland picked up the phone at the Waldorf and he advised De Valera not to go, as it would demean his rank as president. De Valera only agreed after a small delegation persuaded him to do so. De Valera walked into the room and took a seat near Devoy and Colohan and began to refute the charges. He thanked Devoy for his long service to Ireland, but then said he was out of touch with affairs in Ireland and accused the Westminster Gazette of distorting his comments regarding external association. Devoy and Colohan, steeped in the art of boring committee agitation, continuously interrupted him, turning the entire thing into a 10-hour marathon. Emotions ran high. Colohan wagged his finger at De Valera. The president remained calm, although it would have been impossible not to be nervous. Harry Boland at one point broke down in tears and had to leave the room to gain his exposure. The reaction to the affair was curiously modern, as neither side managed to convince the other, but merely solidified the prejudices which by then already existed. This is probably much more attention than this sorry incident deserves. It reminded me of a brief foray I once made into student politics. I cringed quite a lot when reading about it. In mid-November 1920, De Valera launched the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic, which, as acronyms go, is fairly awful. The split was complete. As political movements go, some kind of split with Devoy's Clan na Gael was somewhat inevitable. They were an awfully quarrelsome bunch and didn't appreciate these blow-ins from Ireland getting in the way. De Valera would return to Ireland just before Christmas in 1920. Overall, it's hard not to see the campaign in America as a huge success, as it brought into focus the campaign for an Irish Republic and forced the issue onto the political agenda. By mobilising the vast swaths of Irish America, the Irish Republic was able to utilise its impressive soft power, all the more impressive for the fact that Ireland is such a small country. In fact, one could argue that one of the main reasons why Britain was not prepared to fight an out-and-out war in Ireland against the IRA was a fear of interfering with the American relationship. At the very least, this held them back a little bit. Anytime the British committed an atrocity in Ireland, such as the burning of Cork City or the sack of Balbriggan, it became a major event in America and offered a gigantic boost to Irish propaganda. So from this perspective, at the very least, one could say that De Valera's mission to America was a success. Okay, everybody, thanks so much for watching this. I'll talk again soon. Alright, good luck now. Good luck.